your friendly neighborhood Kyle. I don't know. But today I have my friend Darko here, and through Apotheosis now, and we are going to be talking about the ways of the world, or at least what's happening in the world, and what we think comes into the future, right? Because I myself see this as a whole transitionary process, right? The old story collapsing, the things that weren't beneficial to life and us as a species going away, to open up the space for new things to come through. Um, and yeah, like as we see now, just to get a whole thing started, the three banks that have recently collapsed within the United States, and now a fourth one potentially happening with Credit Suisse, which I believe is European predominantly. But what does this say? I mean, they got bailed out, so they didn't completely collapse. But again, bailing out requires the printing of imaginary pieces of, well, they're pieces of paper, but they have imaginary value dictated by a government system. Anyone in the know understands that this will just lead to higher inflation and is just showing the need for a new way of measuring energetic exchange. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't. Would you like? Should we talk about like what? What do you think are the ills of like what our current system has been?
Ha, yeah, spot on. So I would say that the main issue is that we're in a debt-based system. So in order to print money, we have to buy, pay for that. Like it doesn't make any sense. It's in the sense of that the bailout that you're talking about is nothing else than stealing more money from people and their productivity, and therefore creating a dynamic that never be paid off. I think the recent number that I read was like 20 trillion or something is the debt of the US. So it's like it's gonna take 100 years of paying back a billion a day or something like that in order to pay back. So the question arises, who is in debt to who? Because it doesn't make any sense because all the productivity is being generated by people like you and I, like people that are actually doing things, working, are trying to make a living by being productive members of their communities, and that is being thwarted towards too big to fail, which obviously creates a dynamic where it's not in our benefit. So the debt, I feel, is like the main issue here.
Right, the debt-based system, because that always fascinated me. The Federal Reserve, which is not federal, nor does it hold any reserves, which is like a whole misnomer. Which that's a whole interesting story of how that was created to begin with. But you're right, like this idea of to print money, we kind of buy it, but we rent it, right? We have to pay back a fee. But in order to pay back that fee, we have to print more money to pay off that fee. So it's like a never-ending self-generating cycle that, and then tied to inflation, because even the Fed wants 2% inflation, which goes to the whole thing we were taught in school, at least me, like, oh, put your money in a savings account, put your money in the bank, and you can retire. But it's like, no, you're losing 2% of your value every year, right? And we can see that. A house back in the 70s, for anybody that wants to question, like, what was the price of of a house back in the 70s compared to now? Did it double? Did it more than double? Yeah. And so it's like, yeah, the whole system was meant as a way to rob, in a sense, the energy of the people, like a parasite. This is why I can always consider them as like a parasitical being within the social organism, because they are taking the energy, the work of the people, and benefiting themselves through the system they constructed, that debt-based system. Then also the banks, through fractional reserve banking, don't have to hold on to their reserves. They can invest it into stocks and things, appreciating assets, so that they can not only retain the value and protect themselves against inflation, but also gain value. And they give you a small percentage, a little kickback, but that 0.1% per year is still nothing compared to the 2% of value you lose every year. So it never made any sense. Um, and so it's like, yeah, it's the hologram, it's the external reality showing us this need for change. I got actually broke this. Um, and well, what do you think? So there's this need for change, and there are some alternatives in place, and I can get into those later. But you, Darko, what do you feel as like an alternative for this? Because I think that'll be the biggest question. Like, oh, we've known banks all of our lives. What else could we do? We've known governments all of our life. How can we survive without governments, right? There's this ingrained story of yeah, stuckness. So what do you think is an alternative?
I see basically two layers towards of answer, and one layer is obviously connected with the technology. So we're talking about cryptocurrencies, decentralized cryptocurrencies, where we can exchange without having to know each other, without, like you said, we don't need to trust each other because the system actually makes sure that every transaction is accounted for and can be looked up, and therefore we have an accountability system that helps us to walk our talk. And at the same time, there's an underlying layer in my eyes, which is what has been driving humanity since basically forever, and that is trade. I have something that you want or need, and willing to share it, knowing that whatever you create, I'll get some of that. Like it's idea of like a giant family or a community that looks out for each other. So if grandma cannot grow her own cabbages, then well, we're still gonna get her food. We're not gonna let her starve because she's not a productive member of the society. And the thing there is that we try to evaluate everything through quantity and not through quality. So someone that a carpenter that creates some, builds a house, builds windows or something, like what's the value of that? Obviously, when we go into quantity, someone that can produce window frames than just a single person, those will the single carpenter. And at the same time, a quality is not measurable in that sense, because that one carpenter may put way more effort into it. Well, like just makes it last longer because he puts more experience and effort into it, and that used to be really valued. And I believe that if we go back to that, out of the inversion of where a CEO makes more money than yeah, than someone who grows food. I mean, the CEO of Amazon makes more money than someone that grows food. Amazon is nice; it's a delivery service, but it does not feed us. It doesn't create the food that we need to ingest in order to survive. So the that is in of itself totally inverted. And if the people that would actually produce things would get the value for the quality of product that they are creating, would look totally different. And so and that's where these two levels come together in my eyes, where we have technology to help us mitigate the trends, and at the same time we got to come back to a quality based economics or community system, where it's about what you contribute and how that can be received by the people that want your products, rather than how big is your marketing budget.
Right, marketing strategy. Because you're right. Like any of us of sufficient age can remember a time where shoes actually lasted longer than a few months without that quality has been sacrificed immensely. And yeah, and I also see it like the profiteering aspect, right? If the quality's not so good, then you can sell more of that product because it goes away. Ah, and yeah, and that also comes a question of like growing food. I mean, that's something that we should all be taught and do ourselves to some degree to help mitigate that cost, right? I mean, like in the United States, I remember as a kid, mowing the lawn and things, and having these big patches of grass that are just there, and I guess they look good, but they don't provide any value. It's just grass. And restructuring that whole mentality of like, oh, you can help grow your own food a little bit, and your neighbor grows some own food, and then there's an interaction there between the community of, oh, I'll take the cabbages this time, you grow some carrots, and then next year we'll change to have a, now have a monoculture crop, so you can actually, refresh everything. Um, but definitely, and I think one of the biggest things that will help us in this time period, because I think the banks, they will go away. We can't save them again, and although they will try to save themselves, and I don't know if I should go into that whole theory of what's going on or why this is going on. Well, a little bit. So it's the centralization. Notice most of the banks that have collapsed are more smaller, right? And I've been watching some investors on YouTube and talking about like, it's safer to put all your money in the big banks, the big four banks. And so what's going on there, right? It's creating a fear to pool the money into centralized, offering less options and more control to the financial system. And then the dollar collapses, euro collapses, whichever currency, and then now you have the idea of the airdrop, which, if you're not aware, an airdrop is where basically money comes out of thin air. It's given into your account. So the dollar collapses, and that's where CBDCs come in, central bank digital currencies, a programmable, controllable currency. So if you say something that somebody doesn't like, some higher authority doesn't like, they can restrict you, right? A social credit system. And that's going to be implemented. The Federal Reserve is starting in July. They are going to be doing the Fed Now system, which is based off of crypto. It's supposed to be a competition to crypto. And that's in July. And so it's like, it's all kind of going towards this. And, but the problem is, right, the main point I was getting at is it's the change of views, the change of perspective. Right? Just like the WEF says, if we made it up once, we can make it up again. Like the idea that everything is a story. And so how we choose to look at things. And so if we see society as an organism in and of itself, and currency as the blood that distributes resources throughout all the various cells, right? The beings, us, as humans, and that, just like a body, your cell needs resources to do what it's supposed to do, right? It's what it's meant to do, to provide that value, to be productive. It needs its resources. And so shifting this whole mindset view, because it's two paths, right? There's centralization, which you can see from all the money being funneled into the bigger banks. More centralization. The government's cracking down on things they have for the last few years, not just in the States. Australia is the best example. And the other side is sovereignty and freedom and community. And so it's just this shift of mindset. And that's why, like, a lot of my stuff I've been producing now is just emphasizing the importance of story and how story influences reality and our interface with reality. And so I think that what you say of creating a new myth, right?
Right. And I mean, before we go into the new myth, I also want to point out, because that centralization is not just the centralization of like money or resources, it's also intellectual knowledge. Because how many people do you know that actually know the growth cycles, that know how to keep the seeds, how to make it sustainable, how we survived thousands and thousands of years without any agricultural chemicals and like weird seeds that just work for one generation and then they die off, and like it's just business models to funnel also that knowledge down to, yeah, you have to go to an agricultural university to learn how to be a farmer, or like it's all these channeling down of information, whereas before your dad told you like, yo, now is the time to plant tomatoes. This is the time, and it needs this amount of shade and it needs this amount of fertilizer and so on. And so all of these kind of informations, they are not really part of our society anymore, and they are so essential. Like if we don't know how to create the resources that we need to survive, we are definitely dependent upon something that will provide these resources. And so I see that these two dynamics coming together in this centralization that has this idea of, yeah, well, if we build the perfect greenhouses, then we'll be able to feed the population with crap that they actually don't want to eat. And instead of, like you said, everyone having their own little garden, and then having community gardens where things can be grown that need bigger scale of cooperation. But all of these things are things that literally brought us here. Like we have done that for so long, and now loss of all of this information, we feel mm, easily dependable.
Mhm. Yeah, you're exactly right. You bring up a good point, the centralization of information, because that's the biggest problem, right? We have been the system's kind of created ignorance, and you're dependent on authority, right? Like you said, a top down, right? You have to go to school to learn how to do the seeds. And when you have this centralization of information, right, you can now easily manipulate information. Look at history, look at scientific research and different things that have investments into it. And so you can now, because you are the authority of this information, you can now mold it into whatever way you want for people to understand or to not understand. Yeah, breeding
Right.
dependency.
That's the whole control spiel. Because without dependency, why would anyone listen to you? Like if we because the thing is, the truth is, we don't need banks, we don't need in these giant institutions, we don't need institutions that take care of things that we could take care of ourselves easily if we would work together. And the only reason we don't work together is because of that created dependency upon governmental structures and all of these agencies that are agents of our own being and welfare and thriving in life. And so that's where the dependency really kicks in, and that's basically connected to this new mythology, right? Where what is the old mythology? We used to think that we have to appease the nature spirits and the goddess of harvest, with like a certain ritual so that the harvest is good and it doesn't get destroyed, and so we have enough food for the next winter or whatever. And at the same time, that got dismantled by science, where we realized, wait, actually there are different factors that are just as important, because if you don't put enough nutrients in the ground, then fertile soil. And now the question is, these two perspectives is basically like our brain, right? The left and the right brain hemisphere. The right brain, the feminine brain, being, no, I need to give thanks. I need to sing to the plants. I need to enjoy what I'm doing so that what comes out is actually nurturing. And the left brain that is like, well, you need to add X amount of water and fertilizer and so on in order to have a specific outcome. And when these two come together, where we don't just follow science blindly, but we also don't. Our great great grandfather used to do that, and so this is how we do it. It's like, well, it doesn't make any sense at all. But okay, well, that's how. Together, that's where we step into the new mythology, into something that is literally new because it hasn't been practiced the way that towards us, at least in the last, I don't know, 100, 200 years.
Right. And so now I have a question. Because as you were saying that, the idea popped in my head of like, wait, what, what if the original way wasn't wrong? What if it's education, knowledge, these types of perceptions that kind of distort our reality? I know there's a way, I've been try to explain this in videos recently, but it's like, what if the giving thanks in prayer is what where attention goes, energy flows. So that was actually giving the nutrients to the plants, and we didn't know anything about it. We're just like, oh, this works. And it's actually like all these other definitions of science looking at it and like, oh, because if you're looking for something, you will find something, right? There is no nothingness within this creation, right? And So if consciousness looks, the observer effect, if consciousness looks, something will come into creation to fill that void. And so, if, like, I guess I just start the question of like, oh wait, maybe it is going back to that simplicity that actually influences reality the most, and we're actually taking some of our power away by having all these definitions and molecules and different things instead of like, wait, I'm going to think myself health. I'm going to give thanks, create this energy in me by having that gratitude, and that's what actually influences the soil to be productive for the food.
Right. I think what we're talking about in the sense is that these two levels, the scientific approach and the magical approach, these two are there to balance each other, because all the magical acts that we are doing that are not actually beneficial can be dissolved through the scientific approach by seeing, well, yeah, that's all nice and good, but have that effect. I can measure that just like, yeah, the tomatoes are still tiny, at least for us right now. So it's like a leveling of what does actually work and what doesn't, because it's the same thing in the other way. I can have like all these scientific approaches, but if I'm not actually grateful for it, it will not have the same nutritional value for my body than if I eat something that I'm actually grateful for. Like that's just pure epigenetics there. So these two sides, I feel they kind of like there to balance each other into a way where science meets magical thinking, where they bring together a balance point that is so, yeah, that literally dissolves in both worlds and both perspectives everything that is not necessary or doesn't really serve, and thus create this new way of yeah, doing things.
A more efficient way, right? Using the actual scientific method, what works, what doesn't, eliminating what doesn't work to find more to the truth. Hello there, Joni Rotten. Let me see if I can do the same. Um, yeah, because now it's starting to think of like my mind's going into how did it come to be? Because it's like it's almost as if it was all feminine at one point, right? It was all ceremony. There was no science. There was no seeking of things. It was just like, I'm gonna go do what feels right. We can communicate to the plants. That's how like people knew that this plant was good for this thing, maybe. And then at some point, the masculine was introduced and went to the complete opposite of logical thinking. It's pure science. If it's not within our understanding, then it does not exist. And now, as you said, I think you're right. It's like, okay, now it's a balancing. And because now we have both sides in synchronicity, there's now a more abundance of energy.
The echo comes around.
It does come around. We don't know what's going on there. Like, we're both